Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our seminar. We're just waiting to collect everybody in before we start. We've had somewhere 140 people have registered. So in a moment, I'll formally open the session as your chairman for the afternoon. Right, well, I think we've gathered everyone together. So it's a real pleasure to be able to be chairing this afternoon's session. My name is Malcolm Harbour. I'm privileged to be an associate of Connected Places Catapult. So I act in an advisory capacity, particularly on our programme Challenging Procurement, which is addressing issues about how to make procurement more innovative. So I'll be animating the session this afternoon, particularly chairing the discussion session. I have a long interest in innovative procurement, particularly from my time when I was in the European Parliament and worked on all the legislation. And subsequently, I've also been doing a project with the local government association about procurement of innovation, and I've written some reports for Connected Places that you can find on our website. So that's my introduction. Just a couple of other points. First of all, we'd very much like to hear from you, and it would be very good if you could use the question and answer tab on the Zoom screen, and please post up questions and comments as we go through. We're very keen to hear what you think of the session. And also there may well be other people who are following that who may come in as well to join a discussion on the question and answer tabs. So please use that facility. And also just to remind you that this session is being recorded. It will be posted on YouTube. If you're having difficulty getting into the Zoom session, you can go onto YouTube and see it live there, though of course you won't be able to have the same facility for questions there. So that's to get things underway. You'll be hearing from me later, but I now want to hand over to Oliver Kirsch, who is the Strategic Futures Team Lead at Connected Places Catapult and is responsible for our Challenging Procurement Programme and has been organising this seminar. And he's going to set the scene and introduce the speakers and tell you a bit more about our work. So without more ado, I'll hand over to him.
Fantastic, thank you, Malcolm. So welcome to this session of the Challenging Procurement series of webinars. Before we get into discussion, I think it would be great to know a little bit about you as the audience. So Gail, if we could just put up the first poll, please. So there should just be a couple of questions that pop up about you and the type of organisation that you work for. And this will just help our speakers understand a little bit about you. So if I give you a moment to fill those in. And whilst we're doing that, I guess I can say, as Malcolm said, I lead the Strategic Futures team at Connected Places Catapult. I coordinate this programme. And for those of you that don't know the Connected Places Catapult, our role is to foster innovation and help break down the barriers to market for pioneers. Our focus is on the transport and built environment, smart cities spaces. There are a series of other catapults that support other market sectors. But for the markets that we're interested in, procurement is a particular facilitator of innovation across these sectors. And so we've put together this programme with the aim of supporting both public authorities, thinking about their best practice and how things can be done differently, and also to support innovators, SMEs, and new and emerging technologies and companies. And This webinar is one part of that programme. We also provide targeted support to bodies that wish to engage with us in that way. We facilitate sharing of best practice and engage in research programs, a whole suite of other activities which you can find out about on our website. So do we have the results of that poll? Fantastic. All right, well, actually, there's a really good split between different types of organisations amongst here. Some great representation from academia. I'm glad to see, given the subject matter of this webinar, that we have about 20% of you from regional and local government and a variety of other interested parties. And actually, we also have quite an interesting split between different roles. Whole group of people who fall into the other category. So maybe be interesting to hear via the questions what different perspectives you have on this topic. So if we skip forward to the next slide, I think we'll talk about the structure of this session. Yep, so the agenda is very, very simple. I will introduce the speakers in a moment, and we'll have each of our very esteemed speakers talk for about 10 minutes or so on work that they've done in this space, so promoting innovation by means of procurement and how that stimulates regional economies. We will then open the floor to questions and discussion for the remainder of the time. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll give you a little bit of information on each of our speakers. So first up, we have Elvira Uyarra, who is a reader in innovation policy and strategy at the Alliance Manchester Business School, which is part of Manchester University. And she is also co-director of the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research. In addition to that, she is a member of the new ESRC Productivity Institute. Elvira is an adjunct professor in the Mon Centre for Innovation and Regional Development at the University of Western Norway, and is a visiting fellow at the Centre for Innovation Management Research of Birkbeck University, London. She is interested in regional development, innovation, industrial policy, and including in the role of public procurement on innovation. And in these areas, she is an active researcher. She has nearly 40 articles across leading journals in geography, innovation studies management, policy and advice, and worked with organizations such as the OECD, European Commission, Nesta, and the Inter-American Development Bank. Next up, we will have Peter Schofield, who previously worked for Greater Manchester Combined Authority between 2012 and 2019, where he facilitated collaborative procurement for various authorities across Greater Manchester, as well as representing the Northwest at the Local Government Association's National Advisory Group for Procurement, which he is now the Vice Chair of. He has been involved in ongoing discussions on how local authority procurement has contributed to the reaction to the pandemic, and in this role has contributed to the procurement policy notes that have been issued by Cabinet Office on supplier relief, as well as lobbying for the freedom to award contracts on the basis of contribution to recovery. And he has been involved as well in the development of the recently issued government green paper on transforming public procurement, outlining the future of procurement processes following the UK's exit from the EU. Peter has now been appointed as the head of integrated commissioning and procurement at Manchester City Council from April 2019 onwards, and his remit includes custodian of the council's well-established ethical approach to procurement, as well as overseeing the implementation of a more systematic approach to contracting and contract management, and developing processes to ensure that the council's response to the climate emergency is embedded in procurement as well. And finally, other excellent speaker is Raquel Ortega-Argilés, who is a professor and works as the chair of the Regional Economic Development at the City-REDI Institute at the University of Birmingham. She is an economic researcher and policy advisor specializing in issues of regional development, innovation, entrepreneurship, competitiveness, and Brexit. And her scientific work has been published in a variety of different international academic journals and academic research books, and ranges from the approach to advanced econometrics and statistical modeling to case study techniques. Raquel is also an associate editor of regional studies. And as in her role as a principal applicant and lead investigator, Raquel has been awarded a significant range of different projects from sources including the UK ESRC, the European Commission, OECD, the European Investment Bank. And she's recently led two ESRC priority grant projects, one on the impact of Brexit on the UK, its regions, cities and sectors, and another on post-Brexit policy support needs of left behind places. So all of very relevant to today's discussion. Raquel is also involved in the ESRC Rebuilding Macroeconomics research programme on the long-run consequences of adverse economic shocks, UK regional and urban inequalities. Professor Raquel Ortega-Argilés has also recently been granted a Facebook grant to explore the impact of the digital economy on UK economic inequality. So, as I say, a fantastic range of speakers, and we really look forward to hearing what they have to say. Just before we dive into the discussion, though, we had another very quick poll, but this time a little bit more on how much you, the audience, knew about the subject matter that we're about to jump into. So firstly, how familiar are you with innovation procurement methodology? What's your comfort with that subject matter? And secondly, how well do you think that current innovation procurement delivers the impact that you as an organization are looking for? So a little bit subjective, but I think that having a bit of an understanding of that will really contribute to the discussion section. I'll just give you a few moments to tick the boxes. And then if we can hop onto the results. Excellent. Okay, all right, so that's reassuring, good to hear. So about half of our audience are somewhat familiar with innovation procurement. We have a few experts, and I expect we'll be hearing some detailed questions from you. But it's great to hear that we're including maybe about 40% of participants are new to the field. So I hope that this acts as an interesting primer for you. And perhaps more provocatively, and we'll come on to this later, the ability of current methodology to meet your needs is generally ranked as poor to moderate. So we'll bear that in mind as we move into the next section. Malcolm. Oh, looks like we might be having a small amount of technical difficulty there then, perhaps with Malcolm. At this point, we're just moving into the speaker presentation. So Elvira, if you're in a position to speak, then we look forward to hearing from you.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak at this great event. I think it's a very relevant and timely topic, particularly in the current crisis, and also in the UK context, of course, Brexit. So I will draw on kind of previous research that we have done at the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research. This has been a preoccupation for us for some time. We've done some work on this topic with colleagues like Luke Georgiou and Jacob Adler, and also some kind of recent colleagues, PhD students like Sandra Hamilton and Oisi Kundu, who might be on this call. And so what I will present some insights, some broad ideas about what is the link between public procurement and innovation. Also, how does that exactly happen? And to what extent public procurement, we should look at it as a strategic tool at the regional level. And I'll give you an example that I looked at recently in Spain. And also we'll look at the challenges and barriers, and I'll finish with some kind of maybe questions, open questions that we can pick up in the discussion. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is just to show you how this is becoming quite a popular topic in academic circles. So if you do a very, very simple search in the Web of Science, looking at publications with the words public procurement and innovation, you see kind of a steep increase of the number of publications in the last few years. Of course, this is not new, and previously, different terms were used, such as instead of innovation, technology or industrial policy. So this is a topic that's been kind of talked about since the 80s, but recently I think it's becoming more looked at in the literature. So and of course, there are different terminologies, and what we mean by public procurement of innovation has different interpretations. So we know what innovation is kind of a new introduction of new goods, services in the market, and public procurement of innovation is the tools and practices that allow this to happen through public contracts. So kind of very roughly. So next slide. Yeah, so public procurement of innovation. So the way in which we looked at this and the way we think is relevant is because public procurement by the sheer scale of purchasing power of the public sector. I mean, in the UK, it's almost 300 billion of pounds of goods worth of goods and services a year. It provides a big incentive for suppliers to invest in innovation, to respond to this, to public contracts. And companies do prefer a contract to other incentives like R&D subsidies. So it's one of the best ways to encourage innovation for suppliers. It also allows firms to test their products, to demonstrate their effectiveness to broader markets, and that can guarantee other contracts and opportunities for exports. So the public sector can be a lead market for particular technologies, especially in sectors where it has greater purchasing powers, such as health, that it was mentioned earlier, transport, energy, a number of sectors where the public sector can really drive innovation in markets. And it can also kind of raise the bar for products in terms of asking for better things, for higher standards of products and systems, and that can have a big effect on diffusion and market creation for further adoption. Also, Maria Mazzucato talks about innovation having a rate and a direction. So it's not just about more innovation, but also better innovation that can fulfill needs that are unmet. We're now talking about a crisis after a result of COVID. So a number of associated challenges that perhaps could be addressed through more innovative solutions. So the public procurement can create markets when they don't exist for this type of kind of addressing this type of needs. And of course, public procurement does have an effect in terms of how it shapes competition. It can drive market concentration. So, the market creation or market shaping influence of public procurement should not be neglected. And I think public procurers do have a responsibility in terms of understanding the markets and preventing it to be too concentrated and so on, that it's not too in the hands of too few suppliers and so on. And there are a number of studies. As I said, the interest in academic circles is strong, and academics have looked at how public procurement influences innovation through looking at innovation surveys, R&D expenditure, patents, and things like that through different methodologies. And they generally find that it does have an effect. The public procurement does have an impact on innovation and R&D, sometimes greater patenting. They also mentioned that normally effects it's bigger for SMEs, and also in combination with other tools. So public procurement is more effective when it's accompanied with other kind of policy mixes and instruments such as kind of, on the supply side. The evidence is there that it does improve innovation and diffusion of certain types of technologies. Next slide. Next slide again. Yeah, so, but of course not every type of procurement has the same effect. So we know that public procurement is a complex tool comprising of very different possible practices along the procurement life cycle. And we know that the literature suggests a number of good practices that are innovation friendly, knowing the market, engaging with the market in advance, being not too prescriptive in your specifications, starting early, being flexible, allowing variance, things like that, using your managing intellectual property rights in a coherent way, and things like that. So in a study we did a number of years ago, funded by the ESRC, where we looked at, we asked suppliers to the public sector, around 800 suppliers across the both local, central and NHS suppliers. We asked them if, their views about how these different practices influence innovation. As you can see, those were precisely the, kind of engaging early, asking for not just price, but other types of value and quality, did have an effect on innovation and were seen as favorable for innovation. Next slide. And again, yeah. Unfortunately, we also found that these kind of good practiced, good innovation-friendly procurement practices are not very often used, at least in the UK. So while public procurement is a potential, it can be a good instrument, we concluded that its potential is not very well exploited. Next slide. And so, and we see this, there's a recent study by the European Commission where they look at the kind of strategic procurement practices in different countries, whether different countries in the EU are, have innovation policy frameworks for procurement, whether they invest, whether they have more or less innovation-friendly procurement, or also looking at R&D in procurement. And they found very different, very uneven kind of performance across countries. So they found that a number of countries, actually only Finland is a strong performer across the parameters that they look at. They look at whether they have national frameworks, they looked at whether they have monitoring for public procurement, whether they have incentives, whether they put resources into it. So you can question the methodology a little bit, but they kind of put all these things together. But they found that Finland, for instance, is very good. I'm actually working with Finnish colleagues on looking at how they can monitor this procurement, innovation procurement policy that they have in terms of different types of indicators. But so it's quite, they have a good system in place. The UK is seen as a strong, good performer. So it's seen, it does have a kind of structured system or at least they had some initiatives in the past. Sometimes they've been short-lived, unfortunately, but they lack, for instance, good monitoring systems and evaluation for this type of initiatives. It's as SBRI and other type of initiatives that they kind of introduced in previous years. So there's been kind of little monitoring of this and little efforts to measure performance, for instance. Next slide. Yes, I'm going to skip this slide, but just to mention that, you know, it is a complex tool, it's difficult, implementation is often lagging behind due to all sorts of reasons. We also found in our study that firms found that they were complaining about capabilities of contracting authorities. So, you know, there was a dissonance between kind of the rhetoric of public procurement and innovation and what happens on the ground. One of the key issues is the lack of early start, the lack of good assessment of the actual needs and signaling that to the market. So I'll skip to the next slide. Thank you. So we're very interested in place-based procurement, and this is very important. And I think particularly in the current COVID crisis and the recovery from the current pandemic, we're going to need strong efforts to save markets, to diversify economies, and to try to integrate public procurement in industrial strategies to support resilience of places. And in the UK, the share of local procurement as a percentage of general procurement is actually smaller than in other countries, but there is still a lot of potential for kind of using it as a lever. And in the UK, industrial strategies are very biased towards the supply side. There's a lot of kind of emphasis on supply side instruments, R&D, subsidies, tax credits, and so on. And I think public procurement is still underexploited, and I think it needs kind of to be paid more attention. Cities and regions, we were talking about earlier about needs and social challenges. Cities and regions are the best place for experimentation, and we've seen actually a lot of experimentation in action as a result of the pandemic. You know, kind of new solutions coming out of the crisis, and is at the local level where we can kind of experiment and implement novel solutions and test them. And of course, there are local anchor organizations that you know, very important in place. There's been kind of very interesting work done about this in Manchester, and you know, they have huge market shaping potential, which could be kind of further leveraged for innovation and social value. And of course, there are challenges in place in place-based procurement. So in terms of sometimes market can be seen as too small to make a difference for innovation, but I think that could be overcome by taking more advantage of joint procurement, for instance, and collaboration across places. There's the problem, of course, of austerity, and there's kind of not huge kind of leverage there. Lower administrative capacity in terms of undertaking complex procurement projects. Data tends to be very bad, and this is an issue. I love to hear what Peter thinks about this in terms of improving procurement data. There's also sometimes a reluctance to collaborate in circle practices across local places. This is kind of sort of non-invented here syndrome. So there's a lot of innovation, but sometimes it's not properly shared. And there's at the local level, that's where you feel all the tensions and then the conflicted goals that are kind of put on places, right, at different levels and different policy areas. So that's something that contracting authorities at the local level have to deal with. Look, next slide, please. I'm not going to mention this at length because I'm conscious of time, but there are case studies and there are examples, interesting examples being done in other places in terms of the potential of public procurement to drive industrial restructuring to at the same time improve public services. I recently finished a study looking at the region of Galicia in Spain, which has been a pioneer of the use of public procurement of innovation in Spain in terms of the number of projects that they undertook and the fair amount of funding that they spent on this. And I looked at the project that they did, quite a large-scale project, looking at how UAV, so unmanned aerial vehicle, drones-based solutions could be leveraged and the technology could be used for the delivery of public services. There are a number of challenges in the region, forest fires, fisheries, and so on. And the Regional Development Agency has been doing an incredible job in kind of coordinating across the region initiatives for public procurement and projects to drive the development of technologies such as this to solve problems that the public sector has. And this has actually, talking to a number of companies that participated, they mentioned that it actually enabled them to develop solutions that they have been able to sell elsewhere, to accelerate the improvement of the technologies, and kind of picked up on new market opportunities. So I'm happy to share the paper, and there's a new paper coming up, but actually this is in terms of the strategic vision is very, very interesting. And next slide. So I'm going to leave it here because I overran my time, so apologies for that. But so these are ideas for discussion in terms of moving forward. So the first thing is that innovation-friendly procurement. So there is an acknowledgement that they're important, but they are not widely practiced, and it's not widespread. So how can we make it, more widespread as the first issue? It can play a role in regional recovery. We need to embrace the role of market makers for social value. Another issue is better data. We need better evidence of what works when and where. And finally, Brexit, of course, and I look forward to maybe discussing the UK government proposals that are included in the Transforming Public Procurement Green Paper. I see very interesting things in the project, in the paper, but also some aspects that perhaps could be clarified and that we can discuss. I don't see much around kind of how local authorities can address this agenda. I don't see much around leveling up and how kind of current centralized practices can be overcome. But I'm going to leave it here and I'll look forward to kind of picking this up later in the discussion.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Elvira, for a very comprehensive, wide-ranging introduction. Lots of good points. Just to remind you, before I introduce Peter, about the question and answers, I don't see any questions and answers in my tab yet, but I'd be very pleased to have some because they'll help me pose some tricky questions to the panel later on. So I'm now going to hand over to Peter Schofield and invite him to give us his perspective. Peter, over to you.
Hi all. Hopefully I've managed to unmute and you can all hear me. I don't know how I'm going to know whether you can hear me or not. So Malcolm,
yes, you can. You're okay. Yes, you're fine. Excellent. Off you go.
Right, thanks a lot. So yeah, thanks for the introduction.
You have gone off now, Peter. You're muted again now.
I keep getting a message. I keep getting a message to say the host has unmuted me, or has muted me rather. So
you're okay.
Off you go. Yeah, I love this recorded approach. We can look back on this and laugh. This is saying, thanks Oliver for the introduction. I think it kind of says a bit about where I've been recently and what I've been doing. I think probably the main message I'd take from that is that I used to work for nearly 7 years on encouraging people to do things differently. And now I've got to put my money where my mouth is as head of integrated commissioning and procurement in Manchester. And it's not as easy as it seems from the sidelines to introduce innovation. People are, and this isn't a comment on Manchester, but it does apply. People are used to working in specific ways and comfortable with that, and taking them outside of the comfort zone isn't easy. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. Doing best impersonation of a cabinet minister here. Thanks. I think it's Gail on the button, so thanks, Gail. Just very quickly, what I decided to do was talk a little bit about social value. Most of the slides have got social value in them, and they're for people to take away and look at later. But basically, one of the things that attracted me to Manchester City Council was that social value is pretty much mandated across everything they do in relation to spend. If there's no social value in the award report at the end of a procurement exercise, then the contract doesn't get awarded. The budget gets withdrawn. So people have to start thinking about social value right from the very start. Manchester's always had a 20% weighting on social value, which is more than a lot of authorities use. I think 20% is becoming increasingly common, but it's certainly more than people were comfortable with when social value first became a thing back in 2012. We work very much with other services to identify opportunities, and the example I'd give mainly is the work and skills people. And I'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about how we've reacted to the COVID outbreak in relation to the dichotomy between whether it's a place-based, whether it's a subject-based approach. It's actually what we've done is we've taken a people-based approach. Measurement's always going to be an issue. Social value tracking. You can put the best social value in the world into your contracts. If you don't actually tease it out over the life of the contract, then you've kind of wasted your time, and you've probably awarded a contract to somebody that not awarded the contract to somebody that might have done a better job of the social value. If you're not getting it, you're paying for it, not getting it. We're trialing the themes, outcomes, and measures. I'm sorry, I just can't help myself with the acronyms. Tom's is themes, outcomes, and measures that are promoted by the Social Value Task Force, the National Task Force, and embedded in one or two of the measurement systems that are out there. And we've got some problems in areas. I don't think we're going to have time to talk about those. I've got CLES in there as well as an acronym. That's the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. We've worked with CLES for best part of 20 years now, looking at tracking our spend and identifying how much of it stays within the locality, how many jobs it creates, how many apprenticeships it creates, what kind of employers the people who we work with are. And CLES are now working with virtually every local authority that I've spoken to that talks about social value also talks about CLES. We declared a climate emergency in 2019 along with a lot of other authorities. What we've done in Manchester is piloted an additional 10% of the procurement evaluation score to specifically to climate change related initiatives that suppliers have to come forward with. We've piloted that because it's not necessarily appropriate to every contract that we put out there. We're dipping our toes in the water, and as a result, I think we'll be rolling out a mandate that 30% will be afforded to social value in future, 10% of which will be the specific climate change activities. And basically, ethical procurement was mentioned in the introduction that Oliver read out, and that kind of encompasses social value, but also we're a living wage foundation, accredited authority. Everybody's got to take modern slavery into account in a very standard way as mandated by the government. It just says basically, if somebody needs to have a modern slavery charter, have you got one? If yes, proceed with the procurement. If not, don't. It doesn't say it doesn't have to be any good or anything. We're also working we've signed the Care Leaders Charter, which is around providing opportunities for disadvantaged people as they embark on their adulthood. We embrace good employment and prompt payments, etc., and always have done. So they're all part of the kind of DNA of Manchester. Next slide, please. I finished these off this morning, but it's still going to be a surprise to see what's on the next slide. So social value is very much based on the GMCA social value policy that was implemented in 2014, and the 6 themes that are included in there are basically the template for social value within every procurement that we do. We identify the 6 themes and we ask suppliers in a roundabout way to identify which of those objectives they are most likely to deliver social value against and what their proposals are. And that gets scored and becomes part of the evaluation criteria for a contract. I won't read them out. You can look at them later if you wish. And if we could go on the next slide, I think this one covers, next slide, please. Right, okay. The social value objectives within Manchester City Council were kind of reviewed and reset in 2017, 2018 to look at how we would be, what areas we'd be directing our social value towards. And there's a mention of work and skills in that first slide. And basically what we're asking suppliers to do is to look at these things here and specifically identify how we can maximize creation of new jobs and get people who are disadvantaged, either because education's passed them by or because their industry's changed and they've found themselves without a job later in life, or they've had a disability or a problem that's caused them to rethink the way they approach their working career. And the idea is that we look for suppliers that will facilitate those specific objectives. We're also looking at to transition to a zero carbon city. I mentioned the 10%. Focus charitable giving on specifics. So rather than just have a supplier say we'll give money to charity, we want to know which charity and what that charity is going to do with it. So we have certain ones that we do recommend. Also, the work with anchor institutions, Elvira mentioned this in a couple of slides, and I think, whilst accepting that they may be impacted too by the COVID-19 situation, there certainly would be a lot stronger if we moved forward together rather than did it in isolation. And the anchor institutions identified as the universities and I guess the NHS organisations, but we also within Manchester we've got the benefit of Manchester City Football Club, who've got a really strong corporate social responsibility outlook, and they aren't going to up sticks and leave, so that they, whilst they're not a textbook definition of an anchor institution, they're certainly an organisation that we work with very closely in relation to social value. Next slide, please. So GMCA have recently updated, that's the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, have recently updated their social value framework, called it Build Back Better. I think they quoted that before Boris did, but I'm not sure. But they've reviewed the objectives and decided that the things that they want to use as the framework that social value be delivered against are providing the best employment, keeping clean air, creating employment and skills opportunities to support recovery, and be part of a strong community, become greener, and be more resilient around GM. And a lot of that is specifically hanging on to some of the good practice that's come as a result of the pandemic and the way people are more likely to help each other. We've seen amazing scenes around people helping people out who have been disadvantaged just because they think it's the right thing to do. And it's kind of, can we build on that? Can we keep that? People are being kinder to each other. Can we kind of hopefully arrange for some kind of framework in which that will continue? So some of these are the kind of optimistic side, I think, I'd say, of what we'd expect around recovery. Could we move on to the next slide? I think this is the one with some discussion points. We're talking about public sector procurement influencing behaviours. The total of Greater Manchester economy is about 60 billion. Public sector spends, I think, less than 10 billion, and it's going down. So how much influence can we actually hold? How do we demonstrate impact and persuade companies that we don't necessarily transact with to adopt similar behaviours? How do we deliver innovation in procurement whilst fulfilling our very grandly titled fiduciary responsibility to the public purse? And this is something that I've come across regularly in the discussions with the Cabinet Office and MHCLG and the Treasury over the course of the pandemic, when we've been talking about how we can use procurement to stimulate recovery and how we should be, for example, relying on local supply chains rather than worldwide supply chains, for example, for PPE procurement, where we saw a major bun fight and some huge issues that we created for ourselves, I think, by having a reliance on a supply chain that was outside of the UK that kind of could sell to the highest bidder and hold us to ransom. So if we're going to be saying, okay, let's stimulate some local growth, how can we still demonstrate to the Treasury and to the public whose money we're spending that actually we are spending money responsibly and we're getting best value for that money? I mentioned the declaration of a climate emergency in 2019. How do we stimulate recovery and still act on that? The GM policy says we're going to keep the clean air in Greater Manchester, but if we're going to get the city centre to become as vibrant as it was in the past, it's inevitable that the air quality is likely to suffer. I don't think I've read anything. I've read documents from a lot of the other major cities around the UK, and they all have an aspiration to be at the centre of the digital economy and to be the leaders in that. Can we all be leaders, or should we be kind of sharing it around and trying to share rather than compete with each other? And collaboration was certainly another thing that Elvira mentioned that I think we should be looking at. And I've touched on the new procurement regs. I think there'll be other events that will be specifically dedicated to discussing that. But don't waste the opportunity to read the regs. Good bedtime reading if you want to fall asleep. But there is some stuff in there that's really fundamental, which hopefully we'll be able to discuss somewhat more in the discussion later. So I'll draw to a close there, and hopefully I've clawed back a little bit of time and we can move on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, I think you clearly demonstrated that you haven't lost your ability to be innovative. So there's lots of really interesting stuff in there, and we'll remember where Build Back Better came from. I'm going to invite Raquel Ortega-Argilés to conclude the presentations. I hope she can finish around 3:30. So we'll have time for a bit of discussion later to pick up some of the points. Thank you for those of you posting questions. I've got 4 very interesting questions already in the box, and I hope there'll be more later. So Raquel, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Very good. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this invitation. As the last speaker of this panel, is a bit difficult to introduce new things. I'm going to try to use question a bit the role or the lack of international comparison studies on public procurement, in particular innovation procurement. So I'm going to go through some of the main key challenges of some of these studies, and also I'm going to question about what we should do with innovation procurement in COVID or in recession time, and also in the UK case, in this let's say combination of COVID and also Brexit scenario. So please, next slide. So when we talk about innovation procurement, we have to consider that it is not only looking at procurement for innovation, but it's also how to procure solutions in an innovative manner, and this is something that is probably very challenging, because it is also link to the capacity that the local government has at this moment, in particular in COVID, when there is a lot of pressure in order to deliver in a very short term plan. So innovation procurement, as the literature say, includes the development of innovative solutions through the procurement of R&D services, but also taking into consideration that there will be innovations that are not yet available or not really existing in the market, and therefore it has to be a way to reduce to the risk those innovations in order to be able to be covered by public investment and receive the return in society that any public investment somehow needs to be. Also, the procurement of innovative solutions that do exist, but they don't have the scale to be successful yet in the market. Therefore, we have to find ways to scale them up and also identify those ones that have the potential to become a very good kind of innovations that will provide social returns in a widely way. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, COVID is bringing us opportunities and of course a lot of challenges. But if we think about COVID as the fact that has accelerated trends, so we have seen that SMEs now, they have had to really introduce IT and information society kind of strategies that they didn't had in the past. Therefore, this faster pace to somehow introduce new technologies may be helping the use of new procurement processes. So maybe exploring more the e-procurement. Next slide, please. As I say, the purchase of new and innovative early stage goods and services is many times perceived as a very big challenge by the public sector because of risk aversion, because also normally there are many detailed, I think Elvira mentioned, and very traditional specifications that somehow they are very difficult to fit new innovation products or processes. Also because they somehow tied up with long-term investments, and sometimes for new processes or products, maybe the public sector doesn't want to be somehow linked with these long-term investments. And also, I think that innovation procurement, it requires an investment of new procurement methods in in terms of time, in terms of consistency across the administration. So we think about in the countries that they have many devolved powers, sometimes having this multi-governance system is a bit difficult to understand how the public procurement works. But also it requires skilled staff, expert training, and also advice by experts. That is, it could be very time and also costly. All in all, also requires an open culture not only for the civil servants that are dealing with the public procurement, but also from the SMEs and also large organizations that are applying to these codes. Around 91% of the OECD countries have developed strategies or policies to support innovative goods and services through public procurement, but only less than 40% of them seem to be measuring the results of their support to innovative goods and services through public procurement. So we have that still evaluation and monitoring seem to be lagging behind in many of these countries that seem to be implementing procurement. So we don't know very much exactly how this procurement has been somehow successful or not. So more analysis on that, it really will be very, very important. Next slide, please. So as I say, looking at some analysis on the comparison between innovation procurement, we see that at the top of the categories of the main challenges for procurement for innovation, we have risk aversion and also this kind of coordination and management and the capacity. And this is something that stays with this analysis. It was developed on a survey on 2017, but also Elvira today was talking about some of these points. So the most frequently measures to overcome these challenges are around trying to improve the professionalization, training, education, but also improve not only the legal framework, but also the culture to try to do new or try to impose new ways of policy thinking. Maybe also looking at easy where to provide the funding and also specific measures to engage with the stakeholders that are a bit different. And this is why I come back to the COVID and also see that there is a potential possibility to change a bit the procurement, because by means of using new technologies and information and technology, maybe it could be more approachable, you know. So there will be a way to access, to get access to these SMEs that they maybe they were a bit lagging behind. Next. Among the best practices, well, this is what I was talking before. We have the pre-commercial procurement that is more or less trying to reduce the challenges of risk aversion and trying to get into at the risk of innovation processes by looking at the different stages of the reducing the risk and the aversion of those products that are or processes that are not yet at the market, and try to by looking at different experts, trying to check if they are in the position to become important in the market. Well, at the same time, we have other types of procurement that have been heavily used as well. That is this public procurement of innovation solutions. That is more, if you want, a procurement for trying to experiment, trying to look at the pilot and also looking at already end products that are in the market that they can be widely used. So next slide, please. So we can see many best practices, and the interesting thing is that like this is the OECD framework, but is also very similar to the European Commission framework. That if you think about, there is this policy cycle in the procurement for innovation when you have a strategy, implementation, and then look at the new standard practice and look at really if this pilot, it really works, and evaluation. And this is something that the evaluation has been done by studies from, external advisors, by surveys when they are looking at the new instruments, policy instruments on procurement. By looking at the examples and looking at the examples of, let's say, the last studies as well, we can see how the examples are moving from a more kind of sectoral approach to a more kind of mission-oriented approach, as we were talking with, we were seeing at the presentations before. So we see here connecting technologies with societal challenges. Next slide, please. But what I was saying is that when we are trying to conduct an international comparison of public procurement, we can see that there are common focus. So the majority of them, they are based on job creation or strengthening of the industries or the supply chain, or SME involvement or diversity and inclusion. So what we were talking about supporting particular disadvantaged groups, such as, for instance, female entrepreneurship or foreign presence, the stimulation of innovation or sustainability, while if we look at the comparison of this analysis, we see that there are many challenges because comparing public procurement in different countries, it probably left behind the different governance structures in those countries. So we're talking about the board structures versus more centralized structures when we are talking about the different view approaches like mission versus market-oriented, or the different type of regulation and legislation, also culture and language barriers. And also, and this is something that I have analyzed a lot, the different effects of regional shocks. When we are thinking about how COVID or Brexit might have affected differently different regions, they may be that the different challenges for these regions in terms of maybe the capacity in the local government is very different. Therefore, public procurement should be also taken into consideration differently. Next slide, please. Yes, there is an international research study on public procurement, and the key findings, they will focus mainly in these 5 points. So the different type of governance, as we were talking before, also the network contact. So we were talking, Elvira was mentioning about maybe the cross-border effects, maybe the possibility of multi-regional approaches, but also the strategy, the public sector reforms. If it is close to an election, before or after, you have the procurement systems, they might eventually change. Structure and organization activities. How is the system of procurement? Is a multi-level governance system? Is a sectoral approach system? And also, again, the infrastructure. So if you have a skilled staff, the finance, the information and information technology, these are aspects that really influence the comparison between public procurement into an international context. Next slide, please. And of course, the features of public procurement, they probably change massively after being directly affected by COVID and Brexit. So next slide. In the case of the UK, if we think about how the UK is, how unbalanced the UK is in terms of regional productivity, and also how over-centralized the government system seems to be, and also in some cases, as we have seen in previous recessions, sometimes it's quite, it can be not very well equipped in order to respond to the challenges of regional inequality. We think about public procurement many times as something that is coming more from a top-down sectoral view of the world. So it seems to be more appropriate for defense and security and healthcare and energy, things that are more, if you want, centralized. However, now with COVID and Brexit, we see that there is a big pressure on value change, and also the fact that manufacturing and services, they seem to be heavily affected by both of these shocks, and also they might be working together in different regions. So the challenge, and maybe this is a point for discussion, it will be how to think about public procurement, innovation, entrepreneurship, and creativity when we are also trying to consider how to evolve in a meaningful manner. So next slide, please. And then we will have to think about if in the context of COVID that we know that has impacted industries in a particular way, and industries that have been affected by value chain disruptions or lockdown or travel restrictions or activities that cannot be done at home, if we want to focus on those industries, or we want to focus more on a supply chains cross-sectoral approaches for innovation procurement. And next slide, please. Next, yeah. Or we want, as Elvira was mentioning, we want to consider a more place-based approach for innovation procurement. And we have to think about as well, we want to focus on short runs or long run shocks. Because the combination of COVID and Brexit will really widen, will make even greater these regional inequalities in the UK. Therefore, we need to concentrate in how locally the challenges might be different, and also the capacity of the local and the regional government might be also different. And the last slide. Also, as a way to be a bit, one way of doing it is what we did when we were reforming cohesion policy after the recession in 2008. We decided to think about a more kind of place-based approach of policy prioritization framework, where we were thinking about promoting innovation and entrepreneurship by looking at what were the drivers in that particular place, and also taking into consideration that no one size was fitting all the different regions. And also thinking about that those policies and those policy instruments will have to be somehow tailored to the local context. So this is used as a way of provocation, but this could be also a way forward. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Raquel, again, for a very wide-ranging and very thought-provoking talk. So we've had lots of questions, but not so much time to answer them, but we'll do our best to start off on some of them. And just to say, those of you that have posted questions, we will come back to you on them, assuming that you're happy that we can use your email details. A number of you directed questions to specific speakers, so we will record them and pass them on. So I think I've got everybody up on screen now. So I wanted to open the discussion really by focusing very much on the theme of this meeting, which is about the regional dimension. Raquel just mentioned that just now. There's also the dilemma posed about procurement rules, about how far we can, or you can favor local suppliers, or even how far that's a necessary and innovative practice, or should we be looking for more collaborations between regions? In other words, how are we going to achieve some of our place-based activities? So since we haven't heard from Elvira for a bit, I'm going to ask her to start off a bit, particularly because you had an interesting case study from Spain. And I know actually the Spanish municipalities, in my experience, have been doing a lot of things at a regional or a city level. So would you like to start off on that? And then I'll get Peter and Raquel to comment. So Elvira.
So I understand the questions about involving SMEs.
Places particularly. Well, no, I want to know about places particularly, yes. There are questions about SMEs, but we can perhaps pick those up later.
So I mean, I think that they're both very closely related, and I think so. In the Spanish case and the case that we looked at in our study, they use both public pre-commercial procurement that Raquel was talking about and public procurement of innovation. The advantage of pre-commercial procurement is that it falls outside the EU's kind of regulations, and you can impose kind of place of performance criteria, so kind of where the R&D takes place. So, and as long as you combine that with further instruments such as procurement of innovation, so it's not just the R&D, so something happens at the end of it, that you can kind of use that to drive your industrial policy objectives and increase R&D, and therefore open up opportunities for SMEs. And so there are ways to do this, and actually the regulations allow it. It's just not used very often, and that's something in the UK. I think one of the issues is that procurement is very centralized, as Raquel was talking about. There is actually in the last 10 years, and there's the Institute for Government study that looks at procurement spending, and it shows how there's been increased spending with big suppliers as opposed to SMEs, and it's increased reliance with single suppliers. And we know some of the kind of disasters of the last few years with Carillion and so on. And so I think there is, what is important moving forward is the issue, I think someone was talking about about this in the chat, the need for diversifying supply chains and making them more resilient. And of course, and that kind of goes hand in hand with resilience of places. So supplier diversification and open up opportunities for SMEs by kind of being more flexible in contracts and being better engaged with SMEs and doing kind of more innovative practices. I mean, those things are allowed, and I think could be done more often.
Peter, have you got a perspective on that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think, yeah, I absolutely agree with Elvira that the regulations, if you read them with a particular head on, looking through a specific lens, lend themselves to all sorts of practices that can stimulate innovation. You know, the mechanisms are there, but when the lawyers get a hold of them or get a hold of a proposal that you come up with, then the mood might change. And I think that's one of the issues that we've got. And I guess over the past 3 years, we've been on the verge of leaving the EU. So there's always been a kind of a view that, you know, one day we'll be able to forget about the EU regs and go our own way. But actually, when consulted about what we changed about the last set of rules, most people said they're okay, they work pretty well. They've got the mechanisms in there that we could use if we need to. But actually, people don't actually use them, and I think that's the main problem. What I'd say has happened over the last, what is it now, 10 months, I guess, is that where we've had to act quickly, we've gone to the lawyers and said we need to let a contract very, very quickly for something that's massively urgent, and you know, we're going to cut across these sensitivities and make a direct award to somebody that can actually deliver the goods. And then, you know, after the initial panic, you know, by the time May and June came along, we were starting to think, well, if we're going to be awarding contracts to people to, for example, provide PPE, let's see what we can do in terms of local economies. And there's a question in the chat about this, but just an anecdote, and I hopefully won't take too long over this. You know, some time ago, the National Health Service decided, and I'm aware this is being recorded and will be available on YouTube, so I need to be careful, but the NHS went down the line of sourcing common products through massive contracts and awarding them on the basis of price and just about price alone and quality. You know, obviously you've got to be clinically safe. And a lot of those contracts ended up in the Far East. No massive visibility of what happens in the supply chains, no visibility of what happens, what kind of working conditions the people that are providing those products are enduring, and no idea what they're getting paid or if they're getting paid. So you know, that's a kind of consequence of making those decisions. When the problems arose, a lot of companies in Manchester that, for example, were making clothing, got in touch and said, you know, there's no demand for what we've been doing in the past. We can safeguard a number of jobs if you would let us provide you with surgical gowns or various other items that you can program machines to produce. And when we talk to, you know, NHS about it, the views were generally, if they haven't got a track record, they're not going to get a contract. Until we became short of stuff, and suddenly it became a good idea. Now I'm very oversimplifying for the benefit of the anecdote, but you know, that's basically what happened. So what we were prevented from doing was saying to a local company, we can give you a contract for 2 years. You can therefore invest in a new line of material that you can produce as from your factory, and that will be an additional line of work for you once recovery happens and you go back to life goes back to normal. But we you know, under the rules, hard and fast, and the way they've been applied, it wasn't possible to do that. It did change largely because we lobbied, and you know, that kind of element of innovation was enabled, and I think that, you know, it takes a crisis to make a difference, I think, in some cases.
Raquel, what's your perspective?
Well, I think that if we think about in the context of COVID and maybe in the comparison with Brexit, I think that the timings are very different, isn't it? I think that even I was listening the other day, Bridget Jones from the Birmingham City Council, and she was talking about the fact that the contracting, depending on which tier you are in COVID, is different. So they have such a big problems of the volume of different applications that they have to be administered somehow differently depending on the tier of COVID you are. That it of course this is overwhelming for the local government in a moment that they have to also deal with recovery plans, resilience, and all other things such as the low carbon challenge and other challenges that they cannot really be left aside. So I think that the problem of the timing, I have also talked about the short run versus the long run kind of shocks. Is very important, you know, because trying to, you know, in the short term, trying to sort out those industries or those parts of the value chains that are more affected because of the impose of the different rules at this moment. It might also have an effect in the long-term productivity of these particular places, and also many of the value chains, they might disappear by the fact that now they have been somehow disruptive, and then maybe there are opportunities for local players that those value chains are more local based nowadays, and they might stay. So I do think that yeah, there is a big problem, and maybe the place-based is extremely linked. Maybe I'm biased about this with the value chain and also with the opportunities that we might have or might not after post-Brexit. So I do agree with Elvira. I think that there is a moment now to look at what is in the EU-UK deal. What is written there and how that can be interpreted, you know, thinking about in the medium term and long term.
So, I mean, one of the points that's come up in a number of the questions, and I'm sorry I can't call everyone by name, but I have been reading them, is this word risk, which you used a bit, but a feeling that we will not get innovative procurement unless leaders and decision makers are prepared to take some risk in that. And I mean, Peter's example was a good one about, you know, taking a risk on a local apparel manufacturer who could also, you know, manufacture really good quality products and take a risk on that. So, I mean, I think there are linked questions. I mean, has the good responses to COVID have encouraged people to take risks. In a sense, they've always been forced to do it. But I mean, how do we institutionalize that more and get and actually question decisions that where we may assume there's just a conventional response to buy something on a commodity basis, where we could actually start to generate a new manufacturing sector or an improved productivity locally? I mean, that seems to be what we're after. I mean, is that, Raquel, what do you think? I mean, is that a follow on from the logic that you were just talking about?
Yeah, we also have to think about the financial markets. The financial markets have been under very big pressure and still are going to be, in particular in the UK, with the combination of Brexit and COVID. Therefore, I think that we need to think about how the financial markets are going to support this kind of innovation procurement. And it probably the pre-commercial procurement is going to suffer more if you think about. At the same time, I have been, there are some blogs at the City-REDI where I have been talking about the opportunities for diversification. And we have seen that many different industries, not only at the manufacturing level, but also at the service level, they have been trying to diversify, you know, and this might have open opportunities as well. So I'm not trying to not be very negative, but let's just call for maybe for the governments to take this as an opportunity and maybe try pilots in this kind of diversifications to see what happens, you know.
Yeah, I think that's really, we really must register what you said about engaging in financial instruments, because certainly in pre-commercial procurements, which, and perhaps Elvira, to pick that up, because you mentioned pre-commercial procurement specifically. I mean, the issue has been how you get a transition of an idea that's been developed through that pre-commercial procurement actually deployed commercially, which needs some external internal investment to scale it up and get it certified, ready for deployment. So have you seen any examples of that, for example, in your Spanish work, about how they brought in external funders to support companies to get these off the ground?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, and I think that takes us to think in terms of like systems rather than specific projects. I think that there's too much kind of silo thinking, and we do this project, we do this way, we don't really put it together. And I think if we're going to embed part procurement in industrial strategies, we really need to think beyond kind of specific projects and think about policy mixes. Someone was mentioning in the chat as well, how you combine instruments. So it's kind of, you can think about combining part procurement of innovation with R&D grants that help suppliers that are going to bid for certain contracts. And actually they've done that in Spain. They try to kind of combine R&D grants with PPI initiatives. So that kind of thinking in that broader way, and in the context of the case I looked in Galicia and Spain, they had the PPI, the PCP, the pre-commercial procurement, to for early stage kind of R&D, trying to attract big players to the region, and then mainly SMEs together with other firms, kind of consortia. So that was very good in terms of promoting networking and building an ecosystem, picking that up and developing concrete solutions for the private sector. So the two were not kind of very well aligned as well aligned as it should have been, but that was the idea. So
okay, well, that's helpful. I want to bring Peter in because we're getting a bit short of time. What's your perspective on this?
I think, I mean, I've been monitoring the chat as we go, and there's quite a few people have raised issues around, you know, in relation to how much innovation's gone on over the kind of pandemic and the crisis, and how could that be applied in a time of non-crisis. And I think that's absolutely right, that you know, quite often we do the same thing as we've done, and we always get the same results. Elvira mentioned data in her, and said she'd be interested to know about it. And I think we do suffer a little bit from. There's a lot of people out there now and this part of the green paper talks about data as well, and open source information being made available. And I think we need to embrace that, but we need to be careful about how it's used, because quite often when data is presented, if it's just taken starkly from award notices and the sorts of contracts that have been let, that doesn't tell you how much has actually been spent, and it doesn't tell you the full picture about the manner in which the contract's being let. So there's a need to know much more about what's actually going on at granular level. But yeah, I am conscious of the short time, so
we've had a very rich discussion. I do have a eye on the clock because we do have a hard stop here, and Ollie has appeared because he's going to do something up. So I just want to ask you, in 30 seconds, each of you, can you just give us, I mean, what's one key message that you wanted to leave our audience today before we sign off? I'll just give you a few seconds to think about that, and then I'll start with Raquel and Elvira, and then finish with Peter. Raquel, your short, sharp message.
Well, I think that we have seen that there are many challenges for doing a good innovation procurement framework, but there are also opportunities. And I think that COVID, with pushing the trends on using IT more widely, might also facilitate and make a more inclusive innovation procurement.
That's a very positive message. That's good. Elvira.
Yeah, so if we think about resilience, public procurement needs to move from a kind of more reactive strategy, which we've seen in relation to COVID. We still have to see to what extent things were done properly. We have questions there, to a more proactive procurement that takes account of a wider, broader conception of value.
I agree with that. Yeah,
and it's open question whether the green paper is in the right direction.
I think yes. I mean, I think the word strategic comes to mind there, in a broader context. I have to say, before I bring Peter in, my big disappointment about the so-called white paper with the future of procurement is that it considers innovative procurement driving innovation to be out of scope and wants ideas about how to do it, which strikes to me to be a colossal failure of leadership. So I don't mind putting that on the record, because I think we have to do something about it. I don't know whether Peter agrees with me, since he's perhaps been consulted more than I have in this proposal.
Well, I absolutely do. And I've been involved in several meetings over the months where we've talked about what the green paper might include. And a lot of what we've promoted and suggested hasn't made its way into the green paper. And that's because a lot of people have authored it, and you can actually tell there's a number of different authors in the different areas of it. I absolutely think that there's two things. I mean, my biggest takeaway from it is it kind of omits health, which, if Greater Manchester has a health and social care partnership, which are trying to do things together, one of our big issues is trying to get the people in health to move away from those pillars of procurement and be innovative, and they're not allowed to. And what's going to happen next is they're going to say, well, actually, the rules that you've got don't apply to us. We can do things any way we want to do. So the procurement will go through them. We'll lose these opportunities for stimulating the local markets and for implementing creativity. So my takeaway from this would be, have a good read of that green paper and get some responses in. Identify the bits that are missing, because this is, I guess it's like a referendum in Scotland. It should be a once in a generation opportunity. So let's respond.
Thank you very much. Right. Well, thank you all very much indeed. I'm now going to hand over to Ollie for some closing remarks before we close. Ollie.
Thank you very much. That's a really interesting discussion. There's a huge amount to digest there. A few things to say, but actually, whilst I'm doing that, I did have a final poll with a couple of very important questions in it. So if we put that on at the same time, and I'll talk whilst people are voting. So in this poll, there are two questions. One of them is, a repeat of the question we asked just before the discussion session, just to see whether people's opinion has moved one way or the other in terms of their feeling on innovation procurement. And the other one is to gauge interest on, this is an ongoing series, we run it once every month or two, but the next session for this series will be held on the 10th of February. And the second question is asking if people have a particular strong preference for one thing or another. You'll notice amongst there's been some mention of the green paper, and we have the option, and I think many of the speakers and perhaps amongst the audience will be interested in having a timely discussion about that, because the consultation window isn't open for terribly long. So if you vote on that, just say a couple of other things. So we really appreciate all the questions that you've put in through this. There's a huge number of interesting questions that we didn't even get to touch on there, ranging from challenge funds to methods of SME engagement and platforms around that, contract management. I would love to get into all of those. We touched on my pet bugbear, I guess, the transition from pre-commercial procurement into scaled up deployment. All of those are rich areas for discussion, and we will try and pass those questions around amongst the participants and respond and give you some something next week. I think by the end of next week we'll aim to put something out so you can hear from us on those things. The other key thing I wanted to announce whilst we're voting is that we, Catapult and several people on this call are launching a research program in this area in the very near future, as soon as we get the paperwork out of the way. It's a foundational research program which both Raquel and Elvira are involved in, and aims to touch on a lot of the topics we talked about here. We feel that there's been a research gap in trying to quantitatively understand the impacts of innovation procurement. There's an enormous amount of studies and case studies around it, but because of the complexity of the area, perhaps no one has tried to unpick what best practice really is, how we might measure that, what's the impact of different approaches, and so forth. So we are collectively going to be working together on how to start to unpick that. If that's an area of interest to people, then of course get in touch, and we would love to share our lessons. I'm sure we will have results on that in due course as part of this series. Should we just pop up the results from the poll? Great. Okay, so there's a little movement, maybe even in the wrong direction, one might say, in the innovation procurement, but that's great. That's a challenge. It means that there's a lot to be done. And as we touched on at the end of the discussion, now is perhaps the most prescient time to be discussing that. What could be done better? And actually, the leading session is to run one around the green paper and share ideas. Obviously, we will want to focus that most specifically on the innovation aspects, I would think, but we'll have a think about how we can structure that. And the 10th of February, if you're interested in that discussion, mark it in your diary and we'll send out an invite. Other than that, I would just say thank you very much. Appreciate all of your time. If any of you wish to get in touch to discuss, collaborate, engage with our research, learn more, there is information on our website. Alternatively, get in touch with either our events team or my email is in the slide deck, and we will be circulating both this recording and the slides later today. So thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to engaging with you soon.
So thank you also from me. Thank you very much, Ollie. I particularly want to thank Gail and Leanne, who've been operating the technology and put all this together behind the scenes, including the polls, which I think have worked really successfully. So thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon, and we hope very much to see you at our next session. But above all, please keep in touch, because judging by the questions, all of you are really enthusiastic about moving innovation in public procurement forward. We're really committed to that, and we'd like to develop some real momentum behind policy instruments to do that, because that's something that I think we do have an opportunity to do post-Brexit in the new rules that we'll be adopting in the UK, and we can move ahead of many other countries by doing that. thank you very much indeed, and we look forward to meeting you on a future occasion. Good afternoon.